When I started working on my first novel over 20 years ago, geez, that's a number, I very often spent way more time outlining and note-taking and world-building and detailing than I did actually writing. That's because at heart, I'm a lot more of what's known as a plotter or an architect, depending on what vocabulary you prefer to use, to talk about one of the biggest distinctions that authors tend to draw in terms of your approach to how you plan and write your books, which is plotting versus pantsing. Pantsing is in writing by the seat of your pants. I can easily lose myself in plot outline after plot outline, page after page of articulating scenes and talking about character arcs. But I have many friends who write very much the opposite way. They prefer not to plan much, if anything, and to just discover the story by getting into the scenes, writing, following their imagination, and seeing what happens. Now, I have come to believe that both approaches have some merit, and both approaches have some serious drawbacks. As I said, aggressive plotters like me can easily lose themselves in the plotting and not make an awful lot of progress actually writing the book, because every time a new idea pops up or a new change occurs or something happens in the scene that you just finished, well, you gotta go back and revise all your outlines and all your notes because everything is so interconnected and you've got so much detail, it can become a bit of a straitjacket, and oftentimes it can lead to somewhat dry or mechanical writing where, yes, it's very well organized, but maybe it lacks that certain little spark of discovery and off-the-wall creativity that oftentimes planners can achieve in the scene in the moment. On the flip side, planners very often write themselves into a hole or down a path and realize that the book isn't working or the story isn't working the way they need it to, and you end up writing a lot of words that you don't use and have to do a lot more work in revisions and use up a lot of time. So, what is the best approach to organizing the superstructure or approaching the overall process of writing your story? How much information is enough, too much, or not enough? Well, in this video, I'm going to break down what I have distilled over the past 20 plus years of trying to find the perfect sweet spot between planning and pantsing, and that is what I've come to call creating a story map. For me, the goal of a story map is very simple. I want to detail all of the most essential elements of my story so that I know that everything works, broadly speaking, and that I'm on track and headed in the right direction without going so far overboard, especially towards the beginning, that I end up straitjacketing myself or wasting a lot of time trying to organize details on a spreadsheet or in an outline that either don't end up getting used or need to be changed constantly. I want to leave myself a lot of room to write and play and have fun and explore and experiment and see what happens on the page, but I also don't want to waste my time following a bunch of threads that don't pan out or that don't lead to the right places in the story, and then I have to go back and rework a lot of things. Learning to move from hyper-detailed multi-page outlines to a simple story map that can fit on just 1 or 2 sheets of paper, I would say is the single largest contributing factor that allowed me to go from struggling to write and finish my first book for over 15 plus years till I finally finished it and got it published, to being able to actually write and publish 6 books in a series in under 2 years, with 3 of those coming in like 3 months towards the end of that process. But with that said, let's roll up our sleeves and dive into creating a story map. So as I said before, the goal of a story map is to help you zero in and begin to articulate and organize the essential details of your story without going too far into the weeds and getting bogged down in excessive detail. In order to do that, we are going to focus on what I call the 4 primary foundations of a story. The 4 elements that every story is going to have, whether you plan for it to have them or not, because without one of these things, you don't have a complete story. Those 4 elements are character, plot, setting, and style. And we're going to take each one in that order as we work through building out our story map. We'll start with character because, in my opinion, it's really the most essential, most fundamental of all 4, because the arc of, especially your protagonist, will sort of drive and define your story the most significantly of any of these particular elements. So let's talk about characters. For the purposes of our story map, when it comes to characters, you mainly want to know who your primary characters are and what some of the most distinctive elements of those characters are going to be, and then also how they'll interact with the other elements of the story. So in your character section of your story map, you're going to define 3 primary categories of character. The first is your protagonist. Who is the story about? The second is your antagonist, who is the force of opposition that makes it hard for your protagonist to achieve what they want or need, and who requires them to grow in order to achieve the outcome of the story. And then the third is your secondary characters. Who are the other supporting cast of characters that flesh out the story and add nuance and richness and detail? Now, I've actually filmed an entire Skillshare class about writing unforgettable characters and everything that goes into that because it's a large and complex discussion, and I will link that in the description, so if you want to check that out and really get all the facts, you can go there for that. But in real simple terms, right now, for our purposes, for your protagonist, you want basic information, name, very simple demographics, a bit of backstory and history, and especially you want to focus on a few elements of what I call pop, like what makes this character interesting and distinctive, what makes them stand out so that the audience has a reason to begin to notice them, care about them, and empathize with them and get invested into them. And you want to focus on a few elements of flaw. Specifically, what are the things about this character that are going to make their journey through the story harder? You can focus on external flaws or internal flaws, ideally a combination of both. I have a whole video on this right here on the YouTube channel, which I will link as well if you want to get into why flaw matters so much and how to build it out. But for your story map, if you have defined some details about a protagonist and specifically some flaws for your protagonist that are going to complicate their progression through the story, you're off to a good start. You also want to think a bit about an antagonist. Who is the force of opposition in this story? It doesn't necessarily have to be a character, although it very often will be a specific character or person. It can also, like if you're writing a disaster story, or even like a horror or a thriller, your antagonist might not be a super clearly defined character. It might be a force, or a world-ending threat, or something else that's going on. But one way or the other, you need to think about what stands between your protagonist, where they are at the beginning of the story, and where they want to be by the end of the story. What is going to come at them, try to stop them, make their life harder, and overall add conflict and stakes to the progression of your story. The stronger your antagonist is, and the more directly your antagonist kind of serves as an opposite or a counterweight to your protagonist, the better your story will be. Finally, you want to spend some time thinking about your secondary characters. These characters, for now, don't need quite as much detail as your protagonist and your antagonist, but it's still worth thinking about them and building them out. Who are the other people in your character's life? And especially defining some characters that serve a particular role in relation to your protagonist's journey. So that might be things like a mentor or trainer character, a best friend, a rival, like other kinds of characters who fill in the story world, who give different perspectives or styles or vibes going on in various scenes. This is much more interesting to see a story with usually more characters. You can write a story with just a protagonist and an antagonist. It's been done and you can do it. But stop now and spend some time thinking about who some of the secondary characters in your story will be, and kind of outline a little bit of what they bring to the story. Why do they need to be there? And what role will they serve? How will they make your story better or make it work? But as a starting point, that's really more or less all you need to know as you're building out your story map. And I'm going to say something that I'll probably say repeatedly throughout this video, which is that your story map is really just a starting point and a living document, which you will continue to revise and update and expand on as you actually do your writing. The level of detail we just broke down for characters is already a lot more than a lot of pantser writers will have intentionally and clearly thought about, but it's also a lot less than a lot of heavy outline-focused writers like me might go into the weeds on. And a lot of the kinds of details that you might be tempted to start trying to build out for your characters either won't stay consistent or won't necessarily matter or serve the core of the story. So focusing here, at least as a starting point, will give you a nice orientation to begin with without, again, overwhelming you with unnecessary detail. With all that now laid out, we're ready to move to the second of our major categories, which is plot. Plot is probably the place where outliners like me tend to really get lost in the weeds. It is very easy to almost write a mini book just trying to outline everything that is going to happen. If you go micro and really get down into the weeds, there's almost an endless list of things to outline. But for our purposes in a story map, we're really only going to focus on 4 primary areas or elements of plot that I think are helpful to spend some time thinking about and laying out for yourself to give you a good orientation to begin with. Those are story question, milestones, fun and games, and payoffs. So let's start with the story question. In simple terms, the story question of any story is a simple yes or no question that defines what the story is ultimately about and really clues the readers into when the story starts and when it ends. The story question is easiest to find in more genre or plot-centric stories. Like the story question for Jurassic Park is, can humans escape Jurassic Park when the dinosaurs get loose? The story question for Jaws is, can a local sheriff stop a giant killer shark before it giant killer sharks everyone, including him? But even in more literary forms and genres, usually you'll find a story question clearly foregrounded. The story question of Pride and Prejudice is, can these two characters who are distinctly different from each other help each other grow sufficiently to the point where they can become each other's ideal match? The story question of Catcher in the Rye is, can Holden Caulfield find enough meaning or purpose in life before despair drives him to kill himself? Like, even in those kinds of spaces, a strong story question still provides a spine for the story and indicates when the story starts because it's kind of introduced in the inciting incident, and when the story ends because it is answered more or less definitively in the climax of the story. And then therefore we know, now that we have a pretty clear answer to yes or no of the story question, we know the story is over. Personally, as a writer, I find having a strong grasp of a central story question one of the best ways to cut through the noise and get really laser focused on what my story is about and what are some of the best ways to tell that story and explore that question in fun, unexpected, and interesting ways for the reader. There definitely have been times where, as I've worked on a book, the first version of the story question that I started with morphed a bit as I went along, and I realized I needed to change it or tweak it. But even there, having a story question at all to start with is still extraordinarily helpful. So you want to spend some time thinking a little bit about what would be the story question for the story you're trying to write. Once you have your story question clear, you can move on to the second item in your plot category, which are thinking about some milestones. Milestones are very simply the high point scenes, the memorable moments, the flashy bits, the points in the story where significant progress is made towards answering the story question one way or the other. Milestones look really different in different genres. In a romance story, they might be things like the first meetup, or the first date, or the first big fight. In a thriller, they might be the scenes where a detective finds an important clue, or where the killer captures their next victim. But regardless of genre, your milestones are not every scene you're going to write. They're just sort of the big ones, the ones that really move the story forward. And going from a beginning point where the first milestone is very often the point where you really introduce your story question in a clear and interesting way. But from there, if you just introduce a series of interesting milestones, the moments where a fight or argument or discovery or realization or movement or journey, whatever it might be, these things happened, and once that milestone has completed, the story is in a new place. It's further along than it was before. The context and circumstances have changed for the characters themselves have changed, etc. But the other side of the coin from milestones, which are moments of major plot movement, are what I call fun and games, which is a term that I picked up from Stephen Pressfield. I don't know if he originated it or if he learned it from someone else. But essentially, fun and games describes the payoff fun stuff that is very genre specific, that readers of that genre partly come to those stories to find. Very often fun and games isn't necessarily hyper plot relevant, but it's very much experientially relevant. In a sports story, the fun and games would include things like the moment when the team finally starts to overcome their differences and goes through some training to learn to play well together. People who really enjoy those kinds of stories really enjoy those kinds of moments. In an action story, very often the fun and games is the action, the car chases, the shootouts, the martial arts, hand-to-hand combat. I love action movies, and that's partly what I go there to see. It doesn't even necessarily need to progress the plot, although often it does. But 50% of what I'm there for that genre for in the first place is that kind of stuff. In a romance, it's witty dialogue and banter between these two really interesting characters as they do the will they won't they dance. In a legal thriller, it's courtroom procedures and outwitting the other lawyers and appealing to the jury or uncovering new evidence. Knowing your genre becomes really important at this point because you need to know what readers of this genre love most about it. And it's not always plot stuff. Very often it's contextual things that are happening on the page or in the scenes. And you want to make sure that you give some thought to what those are going to be for your story specifically, so that you make sure to include them and to do them in a really fun and ideally original or interesting way. Finally, the last item in our plot column is payoffs. And essentially, payoffs are either major plot moments of catharsis or payoff. The climax of the story is definitely included in here, but also can be character arc payoffs, like secondary characters who get this really awesome moment that we've been building towards, where they've been this selfish jerk all the way along, and then by the end of the story we have this moment where they sacrifice themselves for the other characters. That's a payoff of their arc all the way along. So thinking about specifically, what are the ways that I'm going to reward my readers for following this particular element of the story, whether that's the main plot arc or other sub-arcs or character arcs or whatever else it is. How am I going to make that worth it for them? What are going to be those high point, just indelibly memorable moments or scenes where something really amazing happens? The payoff of Jaws, we gave the example before, is the big final conflict where the boat is sinking and he's clinging to the mast and the shark is coming in and he shoots the oxygen tank. That's such a satisfying payoff because we've been watching this unstoppable shark for so long, and then we watch our hero in the last gasp finally stop the unstoppable shark, and it's very cathartic. That's a cool payoff scene. The movie would have been worse if the resolution to the story had been in a less exciting or less memorable payoff sort of way. But an example of a secondary character arc payoff, for example, is the moment in Star Wars A New Hope where Han swoops in and blasts Darth Vader's TIE fighter off just before he kills Luke. That's not the end of the story arc of the overall plot, but it is Han Solo's payoff, because we finally get this cathartic moment with this character that we've been following through the story, who is primarily an out-for-himself selfish jerk, but he's lovable. But right there in that moment, it's this, oh, he did it! Like, he finally overcame some of his flaws enough to kind of fulfill his role in the story. And it's this little moment, but it's very satisfying because it's a very fun and memorable payoff to the investment that we as the audience have made in that character throughout the story. So as you finish filling out the plot section of your story map, make sure you spend some time thinking about what are going to be the most awesome, most memorable, most engaging types of payoffs that you can plan for your readers. Before we dive into the third category, if you could take a minute to like this video if you're finding it helpful. It really does make a big difference, especially for smaller channels like mine. And if you're enjoying detailed discussions of writing craft or breakdowns of popular books and movies, then I'd encourage you to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications to keep getting more content like this every week. Next up, we have the third category of our story map, which is setting. There's two primary elements you want to include in the setting section of your story map, and those are backdrops and key locations. Your backdrops are basically the space where you think about the larger context and backdrop of your story. So it's not usually so much a setting as a context and an environment. The backdrop to Harry Potter is a world where wizards and all kinds of magical wonders exist kind of in and around and behind and beneath the normal Muggle world. Like, that's the overall backdrop. Is here's this context. We have the real world in a certain time and place, and within that we have a long history where the magical world has sort of coexisted, and there's ways that that plays out and some details that we can describe about how that works. The backdrop for Pride and Prejudice is one of the things that makes that story so beloved. Regency England, who doesn't love that? The mansions, the balls, the class dynamics, and yeah, a lot of the complications and implications that that backdrop holds for a female character. Speculative fiction genres like fantasy and science fiction really need to focus on this, because you are essentially creating your entire backdrop out of your own imagination, and you need to put a good bit more work into that process in order to create a realistic and compelling one. But even more normal genres like romance or thriller or action or a war epic or fill in the blank, you still want to think about your backdrop, because even there, you're still kind of world building, even if the world you're building is being drawn from the world we're all familiar with, because you need to make choices as the author about what you present, what you include, and how you go about it. The Great Gatsby is a very backdrop-driven story. Even though the backdrop is familiar, it's also not real. It's an imagined interpretation of a particular time, place, and culture. So you definitely want to spend some time thinking about and detailing some of the elements of the backdrop for your story. Where and when is it set? And what are some of the things about that time and place that you find so interesting and that are going to most directly affect your story? But then from the overall backdrop of your setting, we can zero in a little bit more to a list of specific key locations. These are the primary places where your story will actually happen and your scenes will actually be set. This is really important because for most stories, there actually aren't quite as many locations as you might initially think. When you really boil it down, there's a lot of filler scenes that might happen in a place that you visit once, like you pass through a convenience store, the characters buy something and then they leave and they never go back. But aside from sort of travel or short transitions, usually the bulk of the story will happen in a few places. It might be the character's apartment and the office that they work at, and maybe a park that they return to several times, and then a few spots in between. But like most of the story, the vast majority of the percentage of scenes are going to happen in those places. So it's really worth spending some time thinking about those locations, thinking about how you can make them stand out, how you can make them more vivid or more interesting or more original, because since we're going to spend the bulk of our time in those places, even small improvements or refinements or enhancements to those locations can pay big dividends over the course of the story. Even in an example like the first Hunger Games novel, where Katniss moves around quite a lot, you still have a few really key locations. You have her home in District 12. When she gets to the capital, yes, there's the capital, but they spend quite most of the time in the capital. They actually spend either in their apartment or in the training hall as they're gearing up for the Hunger Games to start. Both of those locations are described in more detail and are made a bit more vivid and engaged in a little bit more complete and rich way. Once she lands in the Hunger Games, within the whole area, which is described to be this big open wooded space, the open clearing where they're originally dropped and where the supplies and weapons are deposited serves as a really key location. They start there. A lot of really significant things happen there at the beginning of the Hunger Games. She returns a little bit at one point with Rue, and then at the very end of the story, the climax happens there. That's a key location, even within this bigger context of like a forest where it's harder to zero in on a more defined space. So as you're articulating the setting for your story, yes, definitely spend some time thinking about the overall backdrop and larger context that your story takes place in, but then also spend some time just writing down and putting a few key details or descriptors that you want to keep in mind for the key locations where your story will take place. And that brings us to our fourth and final category for our story map, which is style. Style is a little bit harder to pin down than the three we've covered so far. Like your characters are your characters, your plot details are your plot details. Style is a little less grounded, but no less important, and spending a little bit of pre-time thinking about the style you're writing in and the style of your story as a whole will really help you and keep you on track. The four elements to think about when you're working on outlining your style are your genre, your mechanics, your tone, and your tropes and twists. So genre is pretty straightforward on the surface. If you're only focusing on the broadest level of the term, are you writing a fantasy? Are you writing a romance? Are you writing a thriller? That's good to know, and you probably already know that just based on the type of story you're planning to tell. But it's worth taking a little bit of time to get into the weeds of also the sub-genres that your story takes place in. I am primarily a fantasy author, and it's helpful for me to know the different types of fantasy. You've got grimdark, you've got gaslamp, you've got noble bright, you've got epic, you've got high fantasy. Knowing what type of fantasy I'm planning to write helps me stay consistent and helps me focus on giving the readers of that type of fantasy what they're looking for without being afraid of turning off the readers of different types of fantasy. Like, I don't write grimdark, George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones style fantasy. It's not my thing. If I'm not clear about that, it's easy for me to start second-guessing myself when somebody says that my fantasy series is too lighthearted. Well, yeah, because that's it's more of a Princess Bride style adventure fantasy than a George R. R. Martin style depressing sex and death fantasy. Like, both are fine, but each has a different audience. So spend some time thinking about not just your overall genre, but the subtype within your genre that you primarily want to focus on. A lot of times at this point, I find it helpful to name any particular kind of analogs or references that I am aware of. You may not have any in mind, but if you do, list them here. What are other stories that feel like the kind of story you're hoping to tell? Having that as a reference point will help you both zero in, again, on the subgenre that you're going to be in, but also it can just be a helpful guideline both to keep you oriented to the type of story you're trying to tell, but also to help save you from unintentionally overcopying, which can sometimes happen if you have analogs or comparable type stories in your subconscious, but you haven't clearly named them. Sometimes when you do that, it's easy for those stories to creep into your stories a little more than you even realize is happening, and therefore to have a little bit more derivation than maybe you would have had if you had stopped and thought, wait a minute, I really am writing this kind of story. It's like this and this story in my similar space. So I'm going to take inspiration from them, but I'm also going to be careful not to copy them too closely, like here, here, and here. I'll do this and this differently to sort of set my story apart from them at the same time that I'm drawing on them for inspiration. So with your genre details outlined, you want to focus on some of the core mechanics of your story. These are the meat and potatoes of the way that you are going to write it. So that would include things like the point of view you're writing in, first person, third person, etc. The tense that you're writing in, present, past. The types of vocabulary or range of vocabulary you're going to use. How will your prose more or less sound? You don't have to go too in depth on this, but it is helpful to know sort of what is the reading style that you are writing towards. The third area is tone. Now, I have a whole breakdown that I have developed for types of story tone and tone spectrums that are common across all genres. It's way too much to get into for now. I'm going to do a whole video about that eventually. But for now, I will just say it is worth you taking some time to think about the feel of the story you're trying to tell. And some of this is going to be defined for you by the subgenres that you are writing within. So is it going to be more dark and serious? Is it going to be more lighthearted, witty, funny? Is it fast-paced? Is it a slow burn? Is it grounded and realistic? Is it, epic and huge in scope? You have a lot of room to play here, but it is helpful to make some decisions as you are starting out about the tone and feel of the story that you're going to be writing. And finally, you want to spend a little bit of time thinking a bit about your tropes and twists. Again, this comes easier the more familiar you are with the genre that you're writing in, but every story, even the ones that like to pretend they don't, leverage tropes, which are basically just common repeated patterns in stories. It can be something as simple as love at first sight or an odd couple dynamic. It can be the idea of an intense training sequence. Within your genre, there are common patterns that have been played out before, and they are common because they're effective and powerful for storytelling, especially within that style of story. There is absolutely nothing wrong with using tropes. In fact, you're going to be using them whether you think you are or not. So spending a little bit of time first thinking about what tropes you do like to use or want to use. Are you writing a chosen one type of story or not? Are you writing a found family type of story or not? Making some of those decisions here at the story map level can be really helpful to orient the direction of your storytelling, but also the second half of this item are your twists. Knowing your tropes will help you to actually intentionally be creative with those tropes and do them in a bit of a different way. You don't have to change very much about a trope to make it fresh. In the Marvelous Miss Maisel TV series, which my wife and I loved the way that they reinterpreted the trope of a grizzled mentor. Historically, the grizzled mentor is an older, usually man, who is, familiar with the world that the protagonist is entering and kind of guides them along the way and is, wise and kind. And instead, they have a short, foul-mouthed, angry, snarky, wonderful female character who fills the trope of the wise mentor, but does it in enough of a fresh and interesting way that it constantly plays with your expectations and is really one of the most satisfying elements to me of the story dynamic of that series. So if you spend some time thinking about the tropes you know you're going to utilize and lean into, that gives you room to then also think about some of the twists that you want to put on those tropes to make your story stand out a little bit. And again, you don't have to go overboard with this. A few small twists can make an old trope feel fresh again. And there we have it. You have just completed a story map, or you have everything that you need in place in order to do that. And I think by now, hopefully you see how having these key pieces of information for each of the major categories of the foundations of your story will give you a really strong framework and an orientation to know where to go with your story and to make sure that you're on track and working towards a very effective, powerful story that's gonna work without bogging you down with a laundry list of secondary and tertiary details that aren't really gonna super play into the ultimate impact or payoff of your story, but will slow you down and keep you kind of straitjacketed within the scenes that you are writing. If this approach to creating a story map is exciting and helpful to you, and hopefully it is helping to generate some ideas and help you begin to cohere those ideas into a more complete framework for a story, or maybe you've had a concept for a story for a while that you've been playing around with, but you haven't quite committed yourself to the process of, yes, I'm definitely gonna write this book, and I'm gonna write it in a functional time frame where I can set some goals and targets for myself and get this thing done so I can have a book that I've finished and I'm proud of, then I want to invite you to consider joining my 90-Day Novelist program. 90-Day Novelist is a comprehensive program that will equip you with everything you need to take a story concept from blank page to the end in 90 days. Through a combination of mindset exercises, key writing principles, effective methods for approaching your schedule and your consistency of output, as well as practical exercises and a supportive author community, you'll be equipped with everything you need to not only finish a story in 90 days, but to then go on and write whatever else you want to write, as often as you want to write it, because we'll be focusing on the core principles that will unleash your writing productivity in a brand new way. So if you're ready to set writer's block behind you forever and are looking forward to celebrating a completed book in just a few months from now, then I would encourage you to register today to take advantage of our pre-launch pricing, and I cannot wait to celebrate your completed book with you in just 90 days. So with all that said, if you've completed a story map, I would love to see it in the comments. You can drop the broad details there. I would love to look at it and give you some feedback and celebrate that outcome with you. But until next time, I wish you many happy hours of inspired writing as you turn your story map into someone's next favorite book.